Welcome, my dear students, in our course International Banks. We are very happy to present this curriculum, and today we will start our lecture number 1 and 2 together. First, Chapter 1, Understanding the Banks. In chapter number 1, we will present the basics of banks and what are the main rules for banks, definitions, categories, and so on. So, the first point, chapter 1, Understanding the Banks. The role of banks. First, bank can be defined as financial intermediary whose main activity to provide loans to borrowers and to collect deposits from savers. So, in other words, banks act as intermediaries between borrowers and savers. So, we can call borrowers as deficit units. On the other hand, savers surplus units. Generally, lenders plan to lend their assets for short period of time and for highest possible of return or with highest interest rate. But borrowers demand liabilities or loans that are cheap and for long periods. So in this case, we know that there is a conflict between goals for deficit units and goals for surplus units. Banks can bridge this gap or solve this conflict between borrowers and lenders by the following rules. Number 1, size transformation. In size transformation, depositors willing to lend smaller amounts of money than the amounts required by borrowers. So, think about the gap between your savings account and the money required to buy a house. So, in this case, banks collect deposits from savers in the form of small size deposits and offer them or transform them into large size loans. In summary, banks operate this size transformation function using economies of scale. This is a very important concept and principle in economics. According to economies of scale, this situation where the joint costs of producing two complementary outputs are less than the combined cost of producing the two outputs separately. So, the first rule focuses on the size of deposits which converted to large loans. The second rule, maturity transformation. In this case, we focus on time. So, banks transform short-time funds or deposits into medium and long-term loans. For example, banks transform demand deposits into 20 years residential mortgage. In this case, we can say that banks borrowing short and lending long. Number 3, risk transformation. In case of risk transformation, borrowers carry a risk of default or the credit risk. Credit risk, we can define credit risk as inability to pay the loan. Inability to pay the loan. So, savers or depositors wish to minimize the risk and prefer their deposits to be safe. In this case, banks can minimize the credit risk by more than one measure. Number 1, diversity in investment. Number 2, pooling the risk. Number 3, screening and monitor the borrowers. And the last, holding capital and reserves as a buffer for unexpected loss. So, 3 rules for banks to fill the gap between savers, and investors. Problem number 1. Suppose Bank City provides loan services Q1 and trade finance Q2. So in this case, we talk about two services for this bank. The following cost functions: C1 Q1. This cost function for loan services equal 5 plus 2Q1, 5 in this case fixed costs, 2Q1 variable cost per unit. C2Q2 cost function for trade finance services equal 5 as a fixed cost and 3Q2 variable cost per unit. CQ1 and Q2, in this case we talk about joint production, so 10 fixed costs, 3Q1 variable cost per unit 1, 2 variable cost per Q2. Consider two output levels, one